Shortly before 5 p.m. one afternoon in September of 2024, police responded to a residence in Prince George's County, Maryland, and found a girl suffering from a gunshot wound to the neck. Emergency responders rushed the victim to the hospital, where she told investigators that her mother, 32-year-old Tela Brown, was responsible for her injuries. She said she was walking away from a disagreement with Brown when she was struck by the bullet, which sent her tumbling down the stairs and left her unable to move. The girl also claimed that Brown had told her to blame the gunshot wound on an intruder during a 911 call. Brown claimed a homeless person had broken in and shot her daughter. She later gave investigators conflicting versions of what had happened, before admitting that she and the victim were the only people in the house at the time of the incident. While executing a search warrant at the home, police recovered a handgun, loaded magazines, and a spent shell casing. Reggie Cromer, who shares another child with Brown, told the Washington Post that she seemed to be in good spirits when he stopped at the home to pick up his daughter earlier that day. The nature of the argument that led up to the shooting is unclear. In a voicemail to the victim's father from jail, Brown said that the case would go away if their daughter declines to make a statement or fails to show up in court, leaving prosecutors fearful that the girl could be pressured into refusing to cooperate. Brown remains held without bond on charges of attempted first-degree murder, assault, and unlawful use of a firearm. Number 16. Betty Jean McFadden. After being asked not to panhandle outside a Circle K gas station in Pensacola, Florida, in March of 2022, 30-year-old Betty Jean McFadden returned to the store later that day intent on seeking vengeance. She persuaded a customer to give her money, used it to fill a red gas can, and entered the store. McFadden calmly approached the counter and doused the clerk, 39-year-old Joy Helmick, with gasoline, then threw lit matches at her until she caught fire and became engulfed in flames. In what one officer described as one of the worst burn incidents he'd ever seen, Helmick suffered life-threatening burns to 30% of her body, including her face, neck, chest, and arms. She survived with help from a co-worker and customers who extinguished the fire by tossing a bucket of mop water on her. While McFadden leisurely strolled away from the scene, the gravely injured clerk was airlifted to a burn treatment center in extremely critical condition, while police tracked McFadden using a canine and arrested her on suspicion of attempted murder. She showed no remorse during questioning, asking a detective if the bitch was dead, and even laughing about what she had just done while rambling half coherently. McFadden was initially deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial and ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. Meanwhile, Helmick spent 3 months in the hospital, where she underwent an agonizing recovery and relearned how to use her hands after spending a week in a coma. She later went public with her story, saying that she didn't know McFadden and didn't understand why she was targeted. McFadden's mental competency was eventually declared restored, and in November of 2023, she pleaded guilty as charged. She was sentenced to life without parole. Number 15. Marco Antonio Rubio. In May of 2021, police in Villa Park, Illinois, responded to a disturbance at a local residence. As they approached the home, officers could hear crying coming from inside. They were met by a trail of blood in the living room leading into the kitchen, where they found 24-year-old Esmeralda de Luna clinging to life. She had been stabbed to death with a butcher knife in front of her 3 children, and the 8-inch blade was lodged in her leg. Emergency responders rushed De Luna to the hospital, where she died from her injuries. The next morning, investigators turned their attention toward the abusive father of her children, 29-year-old Marco Antonio Rubio, whom she had obtained an order of protection against just 10 days earlier. Apparently angry that the order had required him to move out of the couple's shared home, Rubio had broken into the residence and killed De Luna. He had fled the scene by the time police arrived, but was arrested while walking in the neighborhood the next morning. In March of 2024, Rubio pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison and is required to serve his entire term behind bars, effectively amounting to a life term. Number 14. Brian Stephen Smith. During a date in Anchorage, Alaska, in September 2019, a homeless woman named Valerie Kassler stole a cell phone from a 48-year-old benefactor named Brian Stephen Smith. When she returned to her tent, she went through the device and was horrified by what she found. Inside a folder titled Homicide at Midtown Marriott were photos and videos of a woman being tortured to death by a man with the same distinctive South African accent as Smith. In one clip, Smith could be heard saying, "In my movies, Everyone dies as the victim struggled to breathe. The woman was identified as a missing 30-year-old Alaskan native named Kathleen Jo Henry, who had long struggled with homelessness and addiction. Kassler turned the device over to law enforcement, and Henry's remains were found dumped along the Seward Highway. A few days later, Smith was arrested. For several hours, he denied any knowledge of the events depicted in the footage and images. He eventually admitted to killing Henry and confessed to murdering another homeless native woman, 52-year-old Veronica Abuchuk, the previous year. Her skull had been found by a mushroom picker in April of 2019. Smith later recanted his confession and took his case to trial. In February of 2024, a jury found him guilty of 14 charges, including murder, tampering with evidence, and misconduct involving a corpse. The judge sentenced Smith to 226 years in prison. Smith's true number of victims may never be known. After his trial, authorities revealed that they had found photos of another woman, beaten and most likely deceased, on his phone. She was recently identified as Cassandra Lee Boskovsky, who went missing in August of 2019. Her body has never been found, and police say there isn't enough evidence to charge Smith with her murder. It's unclear whether Smith killed any women in South Africa before migrating to the US on a marriage visa. His former mistress, Alicia Youngblood, had tried to raise the alarm a year before his arrest, and months prior to the murders of Henry and Abuchuk, Smith had told Youngblood some disturbing details about alleged past victims, but she was unable to extract more information about the crimes for law enforcement. The convicted serial killer continues to maintain his innocence from behind bars, claiming that his confession was coerced and that he knows nothing about the murders he was found guilty of. Number 13. Edward William Johnston. When 50-year-old Edward William Johnston abruptly moved out of 48-year-old Nicolette Gershie's apartment in Malta after 2 years of dating and returned to Ireland in late 2023, she focused on moving forward with her life. Several months later, Johnston contacted Gershie, wanting to reconcile, but she refused and was subjected to a relentless stalking and harassment campaign at the hands of her ex. Outraged by Gershie's unwillingness to get back together, Johnston created fake social media profiles using her photos and spread vicious lies about her personal life. He also tried getting her fired from her job at an HSBC bank, where she works as the head of mortgages, and posted her address and other personal information online while encouraging strangers to visit her. Gershie started reporting Johnston's crimes in April of 2024. 4 months later, she was scrolling through Tinder when she noticed that Johnston had returned to Malta from Ireland. Terrified that he was there to harm her, she contacted the police with her concerns, but no further action was taken. She proceeded to send her Facebook login credentials to a family member in case something happened to her. 3 days later, Johnston stabbed Gershie to death at her apartment in the city of Birkirkara. She had changed her locks to prevent Johnston from getting into the apartment, but he had still found a way in. After killing Gershie, Johnston went to a hotel bar where he demanded a beer at gunpoint after the bartender told him they were closed for the night. He then fled the scene and ran down to the beach, where he engaged law enforcement in a lengthy standoff. The tense confrontation came to an end when Johnston charged at police with a real-looking replica handgun, prompting an officer to shoot him in self-defense. Although Gershie's last report to police went unanswered, the detective overseeing the harassment case was cleared of any wrongdoing based on his understanding that the situation was considered low risk. A look into Johnston's past revealed that he had previously served prison time for making a bomb threat at a restaurant, but his history offered no additional major clues that he was prone to homicidal tendencies. Number 12. Kevin Eastman. When 53-year-old trumpet player Scott Sessions failed to show up for a scheduled performance in Johnstown, Colorado, in February of 2020, his bandmates knew something was wrong. The notoriously punctual musician was reported missing the next day. Not long after that, a snow-plow driver found Sessions' body. He had been bound in plastic and duct tape and set on fire, and his throat had been cut with so much force that he was nearly decapitated. Investigators quickly narrowed their sights on Sessions' recent girlfriend, Heather Frank, who he had met the previous month when she watched him perform at an event. Suspecting a deadly love triangle, they began performing surveillance on Frank and her on and off boyfriend of several years, Kevin Eastman. The relationship between Frank and Eastman was fraught with violence and abuse, but Frank seemed unable to fully escape from the clutches of her longtime lover. Cell phone location data placed Sessions, Frank, and Eastman in Frank's apartment together on the night of the murder, and showed that Frank and Eastman had traveled to where Sessions' body was later found. Using this information, detectives obtained a warrant to place a GPS device on Eastman's car and began tracking the vehicle's movements. After seeing him and Frank leaving Frank's apartment together, after becoming suspicious that the pair were destroying evidence, police decided that it was time to make an arrest. But when they pulled Eastman over, Frank was no longer with him. A few hours later, her body was found in a burn pit on a property that Eastman had visited earlier that day. During questioning, Eastman behaved noticeably strangely, at one point getting on his knees and praying before singing Amazing Grace. He denied any involvement in the deaths of Sessions or Frank, but was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. When the case finally went to trial in 2022, the jury found him guilty on both counts, resulting in 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole plus 27 years. Eastman continues to maintain his innocence from behind bars as he appeals his case. Number 11. Sonny Kim. Just days before Christmas in 2016, Nikki Braswell awoke to a repeated explosive sound inside the Martinez, Georgia home she shared with her husband and 2 children. She initially thought her kids were setting off firecrackers indoors and was confused because they were old enough to know better. Braswell soon discovered that her teenage son, Sonny Christopher Kim, had shot his 23-year-old sister, Ashley Kim, 8 times while she sat on the sofa. Sonny's stepfather, James Braswell, would later describe his eyes as black and unfocused. He had not been his normal self that night and had opened fire on Ashley in a completely unprovoked fashion while she visited from Colorado for the holidays. After shooting his sister, Sonny pointed the gun at his stepfather and pulled the trigger twice, apparently unaware that he had emptied the magazine. James restrained Sonny until law enforcement arrived, preventing any more household members from being harmed. During interrogation, Sonny admitted to shooting Ashley and said that he had planned on killing his entire family. He was unable to provide a reason for his actions, which remain unexplained to this day, and he behaved strangely during the interview, often talking to himself and people who weren't there. Prosecutors accused Sonny of murdering Ashley out of jealousy, but the siblings' parents insisted that this wasn't the case. Nikki believed that something dark and evil overcame her son that day and said that she had never seen him in that state before. Experts testified that Sonny was exceptionally intelligent but suffered from various psychiatric ailments, and the judge ultimately ruled that his mental issues did not affect his competency. In July of 2019, Sonny pleaded guilty but mentally ill to felony murder, malice murder, aggravated assault, and 2 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. He was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years and is receiving mental treatment during his incarceration due to the nature of his plea. Number 10. Natalie Keepers and David Eisenhower. When a teenage liver transplant recipient named Nicole Lovell vanished from her home in Christiansburg in January of 2016, her well-being immediately became a major topic of concern. She needed to take medication regularly in order to avoid getting sick, which was more or less guaranteed to happen if she went more than a few days without it. Several days after Lovell disappeared, her body was found in Surry County, North Carolina. She had been stabbed to death, and investigators quickly traced the crime to 2 19-year-old Virginia Tech freshmen, David Eisenhower and Natalie Keepers. Eisenhower had killed Lovell in order to prevent anyone from finding out about their inappropriate relationship, which began after the 2 met online, and Keepers had helped him plan the murder and cover it up. When questioned about her own motives for participating in the crime, Keepers would later tell detectives that she was a sociopath in training. On the night Lovell went missing, she snuck out of her bedroom window with a blanket and her cell phone. She believed she was going for a romantic walk in the woods with Eisenhower, blissfully unaware that she was being lured to her death. After killing Lovell at a location near her home that he and Keepers had scouted ahead of time, the murderous pair hid the knife in the forest, dumped the victim's belongings in a river and a dumpster, and drove her body to the site where it was found in North Carolina. Text messages revealed that Eisenhower was confident they would never get caught, but they didn't conceal the crime as well as they had thought. Eisenhower's Lexus was equipped with a GPS device, which tracked the vehicle's movements to the body dump site, and Lovell's blood was found in his trunk. In February of 2018, Eisenhower was found guilty of first-degree murder, abduction, and concealing a dead body. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years, followed by 20 years of probation. Later that year, Keepers was convicted of concealment of a dead body, and accessory before the fact. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Number 9. Jonathan Quiles. Ayanna Sawyer was 5 months pregnant when she left her high school in Jacksonville, Florida, during her lunch break in December of 2018 and never returned. While investigating her disappearance, police discovered that the father of her child was her married uncle. Sawyer and 33-year-old Jonathan Quiles had started a relationship the previous year. After learning Sawyer was expecting a child, Quiles had tried convincing her to terminate the pregnancy. His wife, Sawyer's aunt, was also pregnant at the time, but Sawyer was adamant about keeping her child. Evidence revealed that on the day Sawyer went missing, she drove to the junkyard where Quiles worked, believing that they were going to run away together. Witnesses, including Quiles' brother and a fellow inmate he befriended in pre-trial detention, would later testify that he admitted to strangling and shooting Sawyer. He then wrapped her body in a carpet and put her in a dumpster, knowing it would be emptied and taken to a landfill later that day. A search of the landfill turned up several of Sawyer's belongings, but her body was never found. Prosecutors nevertheless decided to move forward with a murder case, and Quiles was arrested roughly 7 months after Sawyer disappeared. He maintained his innocence, arguing that Sawyer could still be alive since her body was never found, but the state remained confident that he was guilty and opted to pursue the death penalty. Quiles spent nearly 5 years in pre-trial detention before the case finally went to trial in September of 2023. He was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Records show that his motion for a new trial was denied, and he appears to be in the process of appealing his case. Number 8. William Miller. 22-year-old University of Arkansas student Rebecca Gould disappeared without a trace in 2004, just weeks after she left her hometown of Melbourne to begin her college studies. She vanished during a weekend visit home to visit her boyfriend and was last seen leaving a convenience store. A week later, Gould's body was found near a highway miles away in Izard County. She had been bludgeoned to death and bore no evidence of defensive injuries, indicating that her killer took her by complete surprise and gave her no time to react. The case went unsolved for 16 years before receiving renewed interest in 2020 from true crime podcaster George Jarrett, who had reported on Gould's disappearance and murder while working as a journalist. Determined to solve the case, he teamed up with Jen Buchholz, a police investigator from Colorado. As part of their investigative efforts, they started a Facebook page dedicated to solving the murder. It drew a large following, but Jared and Buchholz found it odd that a man living in the Philippines named William Miller took such a deep interest in the case. Miller messaged the page's administrators directly and also left comments in what appeared to be an attempt to be helpful, but his fixation on Gould's murder seemed odd, and other followers took notice. A genealogy expert soon discovered that Miller was a cousin of the boyfriend Gould was staying with when she was killed. A job had brought him to the Philippines, where he was living with his wife and 2 children. Jared and Buchholz shared their suspicions with the police, and an investigation was launched. A few months later, Miller was taken into custody. He confessed to killing Gould with a piano leg after she let him inside her boyfriend's home to use the phone, claiming she said something that triggered his explosive temper, but that he couldn't remember what the statement was. Miller also admitted that he allowed suspicion to fall on other people, including his cousin, because it kept the focus off of him. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a 40-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Number 7. MIM Thomas. Over a 4-month period started in October of 2020, an Ohio teenager named MIM Thomas was involved in 4 separate homicides in Cincinnati. The first victim, Devin Lipscomb, was Thomas's co-conspirator in a robbery gone wrong. Lipscomb was fatally shot by the victim, and Thomas was held responsible for his death. A few months later, Thomas lured 19-year-old Terrence North to a location under the guise of buying drugs. He shot into the unsuspecting victim's car, killing North and seriously injuring a passenger who was shot in the face. In February of 2021, a man named Carl Godfrey hired Thomas and 2 others to kill a man Godfrey owed money to. The 3 gunmen fired 21 shots into an SUV, injuring the intended target and killing 27-year-old DeAndre Otis. 2 days later, Thomas killed an innocent bystander, 30-year-old Donnell Steele during a revenge shooting against someone who had shot up his friend's car 2 years after the spate of killings. Thomas was indicted on 27 charges, including multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, felonious assault, and aggravated robbery. In 2023, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of manslaughter, 3 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of robbery, and gun charges, in exchange for a prison sentence of 31 to 36.5 years. During the hearing, he was seen smirking several times, and he laughed when a victim's surviving family member called him out on his behavior, showing a blatant lack of remorse for his crimes. Number 6. Gregory Ramos. 46-year-old Gail Clevenger vanished from her DeBarry, Florida home in November of 2018 while her husband was out of town. She was reported missing by her teenage son, Gregory Ramos, who claimed that he arrived home from school to find his mother's van running in the driveway, an evidence of a home burglary. But the burglary appeared staged, and there were various inconsistencies in Ramos's story, leading investigators to suspect that he knew more than he was admitting to. Under pressure from detectives, Ramos confessed to attacking Clevenger as she slept and strangling her to death after an argument about his grades. He showed no emotion as he explained that it took him about a half hour to kill his mother after his first strangulation attempt had failed. The sergeant who interrogated him would later tell Click Orlando that he seemed cold, calculated, and proud of his actions. After killing his mother, Ramos used a wheelbarrow to load the body into her van and drove to a nearby church, where 2 friends helped him bury Clevenger's remains beneath an outdoor fire pit. He also removed several items from the home in his efforts to make it appear as though it had been robbed, including a PlayStation console and a rifle. Prior to his mother's murder, Ramos had participated in a police explorer program and had taken criminal justice and crime scene investigation classes at his high school. He expressed ambitions of someday wanting to work in law enforcement, but he landed on the exact opposite side of the justice system with a first-degree murder charge. Ramos claimed that he snapped and killed Clevenger after enduring prolonged abuse, but no evidence was ever found to indicate that this was the case. 2 years after the killing, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, abuse of a dead body, and tampering with a crime scene. As part of a plea agreement, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison, followed by lifetime probation. He's required to serve at least 85% of his time before becoming eligible for parole and is scheduled to be released in 2062 at the age of 59. Number 5. The murder of Consuelo Nicole Solorio Romero. In February of 2021, 25-year-old Consuelo Nicole Solorio Romero was kidnapped from her home in Kearns, Utah, by 29-year-old Orlando Escisa Tobar and 21-year-old Jorge Rafael Medina Reyes. The young woman's neighbor, 22-year-old Fernando Marquez, held her at gunpoint until her abductors arrived. She was taken to a home in West Valley, owned by Fernando's mother, 38-year-old Carolina Marquez, whom she supposedly owed money to. Witnesses told police that Tobar and Medina Reyes each shot Solorio Romero in the head once, then dumped her body along a roadside. There were among 6 people who were charged in connection with the case, which also included Carolina and Fernando Marquez, as well as 27-year-old Ivan Jesus Acosta and 26-year-old Christian Noy Morales Gonzalez. Prosecutors were skeptical that Solorio Romero was killed just because she owed money to Marquez. They speculated that the suspects also targeted the woman because she knew too much about their connections to a Mexican drug cartel. In 2024, Tobar pleaded guilty to murder and aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 2 terms of 15 years to life, which the judge ordered him to serve consecutively after learning that he had laughed and joked about killing Solorio Romero. Photos and witness accounts revealed that he had also danced around reenacting the shooting and licked the victim's blood off his hand. Medina Reyes pleaded guilty to the same charges and received 2 concurrent terms of 15 years to life, while Christian Noy Morales Gonzalez was sentenced to 24 years of probation for an obstruction charge. Carolina and Fernando Marquez are facing charges of murder, obstructing justice, and aggravated kidnapping, while Ivan Jesus Acosta stands accused of obstruction and desecration of a human body. Number 4. Dat Wayne crudup. 27-year-old Hilltop Posse street gang member Dat Wayne Crudup was on parole for an aggravated robbery conviction when he killed 2 male victims and seriously injured a third man outside a Columbus, Ohio apartment building in 2021. Surveillance footage showed him exiting a car and fatally shooting 19-year-old Nicholas Cowens and 24-year-old Kevin Williams in broad daylight. Crudup got back into the waiting vehicle and fled to California. While incarcerated on an unrelated charge in early 2022, he was charged with murder, attempted murder, and felonious assault. In August of 2024, a jury found him guilty on all counts. During his sentencing hearing the following month, the court ordered several breaks so the victim's extremely emotional family members could regain their composure. In a cold-blooded display of remorselessness, Crudup repeatedly looked back at the families and laughed, prompting courtroom deputies to move him to another table. When given a chance to speak, he denied committing the murders and laughing at the victims' loved ones. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 46 years. Number 3. Drew Gaia. In early September of 2024, New York State troopers responded to a late-night domestic violence call at a home in the town of Masonville, where they found Samantha Gaia and her 2 children suffering from stab wounds. Emergency responders rushed the 5 months pregnant woman to the hospital, where she died from her injuries while the other 2 victims survived their wounds. Police arrested Samantha's husband, 32-year-old Drew Gaia, at the crime scene. He's accused of stabbing the victims during a disagreement with Samantha, but the specific circumstances leading up to the deadly altercation and the suspect's alleged motive remain unclear. After being evaluated at a nearby hospital, he was booked into custody on suspicion of second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder. Drew remains held without bail at the Delaware County Jail amid the ongoing case. Today's topic was inspired by Miss Belosa. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Tyell Elise Martin. In June of 2024, paramedics responded to a report about an unresponsive child at a home in Montverde, Florida, where they found the lifeless body of a girl named Jamaria Sessions. She was covered in bruises, cuts, bite marks, and other horrific injuries, prompting the emergency responders to call the police. Home surveillance footage from earlier that day showed the victim's father's girlfriend, 34-year-old Tyell Elise Martin, ordering her Rottweiler to maul Sessions. After the dog attack, Martin could be seen kicking, dragging, and shaking the young girl. Sessions' injuries were in various stages of healing, indicating a history of mistreatment. Other evidence, including text messages, further pointed toward a prolonged pattern of abuse. Session was reportedly treated differently than Martin's children, who also lived at the residence and were encouraged to mistreat her. Martin remains in custody at the Lake County Detention Center on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated abuse, and neglect. Jamaria's father, Lojuan Sessions, is also detained and is facing an aggravated manslaughter charge. Both defendants have a history of selling drugs and exposing their children to danger. In October, prosecutors announced their intentions to seek the death penalty against Martin, who they say acted in a particularly cruel and heinous fashion. Number 1. Alisa McCom. In 2023, authorities in Covington, Tennessee, began investigating claims that a local school teacher was engaging in inappropriate conduct with several minors. 38-year-old Alisa McCom denied allegations that she had sent explicit photos to her former students and made intimate advances toward underage individuals. But it was only a matter of time before incriminating evidence fell into law enforcement's hands. In September of that year, police arrested McCom outside her home as her seemingly shocked husband looked on. In addition to accusations of inappropriate online behavior, she was accused of engaging in illegal physical acts with at least 1 victim. She was arrested on more than 20 charges relating to 3 victims, including coercion, tampering with evidence, and aggravated stalking. McCom was freed on bond shortly after her arrest, but soon ended up back in custody after allegedly contacting one of the victims. According to prosecutors, she contacted the victim from a previously unknown phone number using a code word which meant he should be alone for the conversation. She went on to tell the victim that he would regret doing this and claimed to be pregnant with his child. The disgraced former educator will be tried on 13 of the charges in January of 2025 and will stand trial on the remaining charges at a later point in time. In the meantime, she remains held without bail at the Tipton County Jail. Thanks for watching. Would you rather spend a year in isolation or spend it in a luxurious apartment shared with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris? Let us know in the comments section below.